I think when you look at the future of this club, the fact that it survived this long, the fact that you and I are talking about it right now, I have no doubt that this is going to be here in 50 years because there's something a little bit magical about it.
The Crow's Nest is a club in downtown St. John's, which was originally started in 1942 for naval officers. And it's been operating ever since. It's virtually a museum of naval history from World War II.
A wise person once said that the best gift you can give a child is roots and wings. And I see history as our collective roots. World War II and the Battle of the Atlantic was a defining moment in the development of the Royal Canadian Navy. That history is reflected all over this room. I joined the Naval Reserves in 1972, initially just for a summer job like many reservists, but I stayed with it a little longer than planned. I eventually took my commission in the late 1980s, and that was the time I joined the Crow's Nest. I figured, oh, it's a Naval Officers Club. I'm a naval officer now, and away I go. Today's club, it's a magical little room. It's a time capsule of the 1940s, of the war years. And I find it's one of these magical rooms that as soon as you walk in, the rest of the world just kind of washes away.
It's a challenge to climb the 59 steps. You know, people would talk about getting winded coming up here. But what you have here is a significant national historic site with the actual space, with the actual artifacts. We try and give people a sense of what it must have been like to go through those narrows. And people don't think about it that way until they stop and think, that was the front door of the war.
The Newfoundland Escort Force arrived in St. John's in the summer of 1941. And the corvettes initially couldn't cross the ocean. They didn't have the fuel capacity or the range to cross the ocean, but they had to escort convoys. So how do you do that? You do it as a relay. So there was escorts based in Halifax and Sydney, Nova Scotia, St. John's, Reykjavik, Londonderry, and they would, in relays, escort convoys across the ocean. So suddenly overnight, St. John's is a busy, busy port. So it was Captain Rollo Mingy, a senior naval officer in the wartime port city. He understood the value of personal relationships in getting the job done. The officers had to get to know each other. They had to have trust and confidence in each other for the convoy system to work. And they needed a venue to foster that relationship. The other factor is post-traumatic stress. And I don't know if the term was even coined in the day, but Captain Mingy realized the importance of a safe, secure environment where people who have had a difficult experience can talk it out with their peers without judgment. And that was another contributing factor to the creation of this club. This building was initially the loft of a warehouse. Captain Mengi had the vision for the crow's nest, but he needed a location. St. John's, at the start of World War II, was a city of approximately 40,000 people. And with the start of the war, the population increased to about 1.5 times that.
We had so many troops. They were building all these bases. There were airplanes and ships in the harbor and troops on the streets.
So space was scarce. Sir Leonard Outerbridge was a well-known businessman in the community here, and he thought he might be able to help out with the problem at hand. And Sir Leonard's wife, Dorothy, selected a few locations, and she and Captain Mengi did a little tour around. They found this place. It was very handy to the harbor. The fireplace was what really sold it, and making a nice cozy room. And the deal was done apparently for $1 a year and a peppercorn. And the peppercorn was never paid. Opening night in the club was January 27th, 1942. And the bar hadn't been built yet. There was just a temporary structure, a couple planks across, a couple crates or barrels, that sort of routine.
That night, they had a contest. They found some carpenter's tools, some 6-inch nails and some hammers and this sort of stuff. And they had a contest on who could hammer the spike into the floor faster.
So where the contest happened was right here. And it was won by the captain of the corvette Spikenard. And that was on January 27th. Spikenard sailed on January 31st. And on the night of February 10th, 11th, they were torpedoed off Iceland.
So during the war, they had a brass ring put around the spike in the floor. And then after the war, they took it out and put it on the wall. And if you've been down there, you saw it. That was where the crow's nest started. And initially, you know, that first night, you sat on barrels, and the bar was a couple of planks across a few sawhorses. It was pretty basic, but it gave them a place.
The fall of 1942 was one of the darkest times in Newfoundland history. There were 2 rather bold attacks on ships anchored in Belle Island, 2 separate attacks.
And then the U-boats came back in the middle of the night and fired a torpedo and missed. And it hit the Scotia Pier, which was the oil loading pier, and blew up. And of course, that shook the island and broke windows, and everybody knew something was happening. And then in quick succession, they sunk 2 more.
My name is Edith Goss. I was Edith Emmeline Piercy at one time. I grew up on Belle Island. I lived there for 29 years. Well, the explosions, as I remember, one was on a Saturday, and we heard this bang. And of course, you didn't know what it was. I didn't know what it was, and I don't know if my father was home then or not, but we learned afterwards that the pier had been bombed. And there were a lot of casualties, of course.
Well, people were starting to feel insecure. And if a U-boat can sneak into an inshore anchorage and sink 2 ships and get out again, you know, with all the soldiers and all the, you know, the warships and planes and this sort of thing, and then do it a second time, you know, that would shake anybody's confidence in the safety of their, you know, their families and themselves. You know, I think it hit the tipping point then. And, you know, people really did think that, you know, we're under siege by Nazi Germany.
I was talking to a gentleman one time who was a boy when the explosions took place. And he remembers that his mother started yelling out for all the children to come home. And he went home, and She marched them upstairs to get washed and to put on their good clothes, because if they were being invaded, they were going to look good. You had the Americans coming in with the USO, and you had people of different nationalities who were bringing their different cultures in, people from Hollywood and all of that who would come and do shows for the American people. Then they opened those to, some of them at least, were open to people in the city. So there would have been all of these people like Frank Sinatra and so on that would have shown up. It would have been just an amazing, amazing place in that sense.
St. John's was typical St. John's. We used to come over just to do for your own business, probably get groceries or go shopping, or my father probably get a car or something. And we used to be fooling down around the harbor, you know, and we did see the train that was across the rock. Hopefully, stopped submarines from coming in.
You had great music, and you had very friendly people, and many war brides were swept up to the dismay of the local fellows. And if you had to be somewhere, this is a pretty good rock in the Atlantic to be in. It was kind of a feeling, I think, that everyone was in it together, and we had to go through this terrible thing. Let's try and do it with as much of a smile as we can. And I think they did a great job of that.
I think it was in the early 80s. I was here with my father, and he said, let's go down to the Crow's Nest. I didn't really know what the Crow's Nest was, but I came down here with him, and I immediately was, you know, really impressed with the place and got a greater appreciation of my father's earlier life in the Navy. Surgeon Lieutenant Commander Anthony Padden, my father, was from Labrador originally, and he entered the Royal Canadian Naval Volunteer Reserve after he finished med school. And he served on minesweepers, and then he was on the North Atlantic in convoy escorts. Then he was transferred to minesweepers again for the Normandy invasion, and he was off the beaches for quite a few days there sweeping mines. And then he was transferred to a frigate, HMCS Team, which was in the English Channel on the night of March 29th, 1945, when it was struck by a German torpedo, which removed the rearmost 60 feet of the ship. And there were a number of casualties.
Life on the convoys was pretty amazing and pretty hard. Not only did they have the U-boats to worry about, they also had the very rough seas in the North Atlantic. And through the winter months, when the ice came in, it was even far more dangerous.
Well, seasickness for some occurred every time, but they got over it very quickly. And if they didn't and it became permanent, they had to leave the ship because it was just, well, it was dangerous. They would starve to death, literally, in the process.
And of course, Dave's father, there's one tale of him doing a surgery at sea. He had prepped the sailor as best he could, and the seas were running high. The Corvette was rocking, you know, side to side, up and down. He told the captain that when he said go, then to bring the ship around. And the operating room was, you know, calm enough for, you know, 2 minutes or whatever, and whatever he had to do, whip out an appendix or some such thing and start sewing up again, and that he could do when the seas got rough again. And just, you know, absolutely amazing to be doing surgery under those kinds of conditions in the middle of, you know, the North Atlantic, on top of everything else.
Between convoys, Dad and the other officers would come here for a bit of a break. And, you know, of drinking. It was a nice atmosphere here. It always has been. I think the collective anxiety and fear of 2 weeks of coming across the Atlantic Ocean through submarines and storms and so forth, this place must have been the absolute tonic, the antidote for that sort of thing. However brief it might be, maybe in a few days you were back out there again. But just for those few days, those few hours, you know, life was good.
First time I came to the Crow's Nest, I had always walked past it thinking it was a place you couldn't go into. So there is a great wonder about places you're not allowed. So I'd always been, you know, go by, well, all the way up there. Oh, geez, well, I don't know, what's in there, you know? And then somebody told me, no, you can go in there. I thought, really? And so we came in, and it was pretty quiet. There was someone at the bar, 1 or 2 other people around, and I was just immediately transported into this whole other time and this whole other world. And it just held so many stories, and everywhere you looked was another memento of somebody who put something there, probably not knowing if they'd ever be back to see it again.
The gun shields in the club, each and every one is special. Each and every one has its own story. This started in the early days of the club. Again, this room was initially the loft of a warehouse and the walls were bare. And in the early days, the ship's officers used to start scratching the name of their ship into the bulkhead and the deckhead. And Captain Mingy didn't want graffiti in the club.
Initially, he was sort of upset with it because, you know, they were damaging. And then he thought what he'd do is he'd give all the ships a 2 by 2 foot square space on the wall that they could put their gun shield art. And what it was is, you know, each ship came up with their own individual, unique crest that they'd usually put on the gun shield of the 4-inch gun in the bow. And some of them are very amateurish, some are downright professional, and some are kind of risque, especially for the time.
HMCS Wetaskiwin here is named for a small community out in Alberta. It's a First Nations name. A lot of people have trouble pronouncing it. So it got known as the Wet-Ass Queen.
It's a queen sitting in a puddle of water. She's a wet-ass queen, Wetaskiwin.
And this hung in the ship's wardroom, the officers' mess on board. And then when the opportunity came along to have something in the club to represent the ship, this came out of the wardroom and came into the Crow's Nest, and it's been here ever since. I think the gun shield art is the essence of the club. It brings ownership. When you have something in the club that represents your ship, your unit, there's a greater sense of ownership. And with time now, there's a lot of emotion attached to these gun shields, and people will often come into the club here quite shyly, say, is it okay to come in? And they say their grandfather, their uncle used to talk about this club, and they'll find the gun shield for their grandfather's ship, and you know, they get emotional just touching it.
You know, with all the bits of memorabilia and stuff on the walls, it gives a sense of the personality, the makeup of the very brave people that saw a wrong and tried to right it in the best way that they could.
Arthur Barrett is our oldest active local veteran. And he's an absolute treasure to this club. He's just an absolute gentleman in every way.
In 42, just before I joined the Air Force, I had a summer job in Stephenville with the Americans. They were building the base, Harmon Field. And my brother, who had been at Dalhousie University, he was the youngest science graduate ever to graduate from Dalhousie University. He graduated, joined the Air Force, became a pilot, got married, and was on his way home on a combined embarkation leave and honeymoon. And the Caribou, of course, got torpedoed, and he went up on deck with his wife, and he was looking around for a friend of ours from Corner Brook who was on the boat. Couldn't find her. He went back down to look for her. Never came back. And he was lost on the Caribou, of course. I was here one night, and there was a lady here. She said, my husband was in the Air Force. I said, what squadron was your husband in? She said, 420, the Snowy Owl Squadron. That was my squadron. He was my flight commander. We were on an operation, and he got coned, and that's when 2 or more searchlights grab you, and you can't, that's the end of the story. You can't get out of that, and you get shot down, and he got shot down. To me, that was the end of the story. I never heard of him since. And I said to her, I was with him the night he died. She said, he didn't die. He lived, and he was in a prisoner of war camp, but he didn't die until 1970-something. And that was amazing, you know? But it's things like that that make this place what it is, you know?
Arthur's a magnet. Everybody wants to talk to Arthur. And when there's a dance here, all the ladies want to dance with him. He's just a treasure. I suppose I could say he's the embodiment of what I think this club represents. And, you know, he's 95, so one thing's for sure, if we don't fully appreciate him now, we will when he's no longer with us.
May 8th, 1945. It's over there. The war in Europe is over, and Germany has ordered all active U-boats to surrender to Allied forces. 500 miles off the coast of Newfoundland, U-190 surfaces and surrenders to Canadian warships, the HMCS Victoriaville and the HMCS Thorlock. Commandeered by our brave members of the Royal Canadian Navy, U-190 is brought into harbor. On board the German submarine, Navy personnel...
The U-190, they surrendered, and they brought them to Bay Bulls. And they did that rather than take them to Halifax because a month or two before, the U-190 had sunk HMCS Esquimalt with great loss of life. And they were afraid if they brought the crew to Halifax so soon after that, there could be some sort of public incident.
After the war, resources are scarce. The Canadian Navy didn't have the ability to maintain this U-boat. So they took some shinies, as we say, some few souvenirs off the U-boat, including the periscope. And we're happy to have it here.
That's a great reminder of how close that war was to our doorstep. Other places in North America, you know, they were at war, but here there are submarines, you know, just outside the harbor. That piece is, it's a fantastic piece of history to touch, you know, and explore.
I can remember a time when, you know, the 60s and the 70s, nobody liked to talk much about the war record. Remembrance Day ceremonies weren't very well attended. There seemed to be a little bit of a collective amnesia amongst a certain generation or two, mine. And I see now that it's becoming more important again. November the 11th at the War Memorial here is just getting more and more crowded every year. You know, there's thousands of people who come to that now, and they bring their kids and they tell their kids about what's going on. It indicates a healthy level of interest and something that's important for, I think, national character and national remembrance overall.
Just because all the veterans are dying out, the stories shouldn't. I mean, it had such a dramatic impact on the world in general, but certainly on Newfoundland, specifically on St. John's. There's really nothing for, you know, the Royal Canadian Navy, the Newfoundland Escort Force here during the Second World War, other than the Crow's Nest. And, you know, anybody is welcome to go down and have a visit, have a look. And they'd love to have you join, and it's certainly worth the dues to join. So it's very important as a living museum, I guess is the point I'm trying to make.
Today's club is a very active place. We have club dinners for the members. It's available for private bookings for members and non-members. And we have a number of small community groups that meet here on a regular basis, and it's a perfect little venue for the ballad singing group, the storytellers, the Company of Master Mariners, the marine engineers, the local sailing clubs meet here, and it's a lovely little venue. The only requirements for membership now are an interest in the history of the club and a desire to preserve the history. And so civilians can be full members, and that's one of the best things we've ever done too. Some of our best members here have never worn a uniform, but they're passionate about the history, and that's what's important.
The best thing about this place is if you bring somebody here, you can tell them, oh, about that spike. You can tell them, oh, don't clutter the bar. You can tell them, oh, the periscope. But it's best to let people wander and look, because they'll figure it out. And it's the kind of thing you should, you know, choose your own adventure. And if they ask somebody, another club member, and that club member tells them a story about something, and if they're any good at it at all, that person will walk away wanting to become a member. The things on the wall speak to you, and the person who put it there speaks to you. And why is it important? Why is it still here after all these years? You know, why is that spike up there? Oh, you want to know why that is there? Let me tell you. And when you hear those stories, you're going to tell somebody, because they're that good, and they're that good because they're real.
An artifact is an object. Add a story to it, and the object comes alive.
I have here a letter my father wrote the day I left Newfoundland to go overseas. Dear Arthur, as the train bore you further away, my feelings and thoughts were ever stronger of you and the great adventure upon which you have embarked. It is a glorious cause for which you have entered the service. In this new life of yours, you will have to contend with many difficulties. It is when these trials face you that you must play the game and act the manly part that both your mother and myself expect of you. It may not be easy to stick it at times when the going gets tough, but I am confident that you will pursue the straight course and be given the chance to move up, an opportunity to go ahead and plan a future for yourself in a land and a world where men will be free to make most of their abilities. Remember that at all times, our love and our prayers go out for you. Your dad. That's my letter.